Hi, and welcome to the 80th TiddlyWiki Hangout. I'm Jeremy Ruston, the creator of TiddlyWiki, and I'm joined today by, from left to right on my screen, Ed. Ed, would you like to say hi, introduce yourself, say where you're from, and say something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Sure. My name's Ed Dixon. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm a teacher working on a student-teacher notebook using TiddlyWiki as the basis for that. And I'm just blown away by the community and everything we have going on here. It's such an honor to be a part of this.
Great to have you here. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I've got a terrible cold, so I'll try and time things to turn my camera off when I'm actually sneezing or blowing my nose. Jed, hello. Would you like to say hello, introduce yourself, say where you're from, and say something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Hi, I'm Jed. I am from New Mexico in the US, and I use TiddlyWiki to organize my research for my PhD work. And yeah, that's me.
Great to have you here, Jed. Thanks for joining us. And next, Mario. But I think Mario may be still away from the keyboard, so we'll come back to ask Mario to introduce himself.
I'm back.
I know you're back. Mario, hi. Would you like to say hello, introduce yourself, and say something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
I'm Mario Beach from Austria, near Salzburg, contributor to TiddlyWiki Classic with themes and plugins, and I'm managing the German translation for TiddlyWiki 5 and some pull requests here and there.
Indeed, indeed, and the chief annotator of these YouTube Hangouts as well.
Yeah.
Which is a task that I'm not sure that anybody else would envy you, but you did it very well. Thank you, Mario. And finally, Nick, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nick Spees, and I'm in southeastern Pennsylvania, USA, Downingtown. I'm interested.
I'm managing the German translation for TiddlyWiki 5.
You've got the other window open, which is playing back, and the chief annotator.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Of these YouTube Hangouts as well.
Yeah.
Which is a task that I'm not sure that anybody else would envy you, but you did it very well. Thank you, Mario. And finally, Nick, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nick Spees.
Nick, I think you need to either close that window.
Eastern Pennsylvania, USA, Downingtown.
Brilliant.
I was on Firefox and it works in Chrome. I'm from Downingtown, Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm proposing a lot of things that may really apply to the next version that you are not even started yet. But you know, I'm seeing a lot of possibilities. I wrote to somebody, and I can't remember who it was, on their Git account, a proposal for string manipulations that's very flexible, and it's derived from the work that was done.
We'll come back to that, Nick, actually, because we're still doing the intros at the moment. But I did see that and do have some thoughts that we could discuss.
Okay, very good.
But let's just go back to Nathan. We've just been joined by Nathan Kane. Nathan, if you're microphoned, we're just doing intros. So if you'd like to say hello, introduce yourself, say where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki, that would be marvelous.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nathan Kane. I'm a developer from the United States. I'm both a user and developer on TiddlyWiki, and recently been working on trying to finish up some plugins.
Indeed. Great to have you here, Nathan. Thank you for joining us. Well, thank you, everybody. I've got a couple of topics that I'd like to discuss, but as ever, feel free to chime in with your own questions and topics. Looking at the Q&A panel, there's a couple of questions. So, in fact, I'm going to take those questions first, then the topic that Nick just mentioned, and then we'll go into the topics that I jotted down, if that's okay. So the first question from Nick was, what's the URL to be part of this discussion? Just to be clear, when this happens again, if I screen share, the the first link that I send each time that I book a Hangout is called a Google Plus events link, and it's plus.google.com/events and then some gobbledygook. So depending on how efficient I am, that's the link that I send to the TiddlyWiki discussion group, put on Twitter and so on, 3 or 4 days before the Hangout. Now, you'll notice if I scroll down, I've also added the URL for the Hangout itself. And that's, if you look here, I've got a second window, which has got the actual interactive Hangout in. Now, although I post that link, in fact, you can get there just by pressing the Start button. So we sometimes in this group, we do make Google Hangouts a bit more complicated than it needs to be, but that's partly their fault for not documenting it clearly. So you don't actually need any links from me. Once you've got this link to the Google Plus event page, all you need to do is hit Start when you're ready to go. As far as I know, of course, they do change the way that Google Plus works from time to time and change the way that Hangouts works. And next question was from Alberto Molina. He's saying, I would like to know if the list widget iterator will be maintained or removed from the core. If not, will there be something equivalent? Now, what Alberto is talking about here is a specific topic, but it's quite an interesting general topic. What happened was that Tobias contributed a couple of weeks ago an extension for the list widget. What the extension did was made an iterator variable available to each item in the list that took the numeric value of the index at that point in the list. Now, the problem is that the patch that Tobias submitted wasn't correct. It didn't cope with all the scenarios that the list widget can be used in. And worse than that, when I started to think it through, I realized that it was impossible for the list widget to offer the functionality of this new iterator feature without breaking some of the existing things that it does. So if you don't know, the list widget, it's the bit of wiki text that deals with repeated elements, and it's used all over TiddlyWiki. It's used for the story, so the sequence of tiddlers in the main story column, and it's used for instance, assembling the tabs. Each set of tabs that you see in the sidebar is a list widget. Now, the list widget goes to a lot of trouble to efficiently update the DOM. So that's to say, when the list that is being rendered, when the elements change, it'll just do the minimum necessary DOM adjustments to account for the change rather than rewriting the whole of the body of the list widget. And that's absolutely vital. It's that means when you open a tiddler in TiddlyWiki, it doesn't have to re-render all of the other tiddlers in the story. It just renders the newly displayed tiddler. So, so the issue is that Toby's patch wasn't really taking into account all of these ways in which the list widget can work. My mistake was to accept a patch before I'd thought it through properly and before I'd verified that it was okay. So when this happens, I think it's quite a major problem, because Tobias's code was in the core for about 10 days. So, I mean, it was in the pre-release of the core. So that sent a signal to everybody, including here, Alberto, that this feature was coming. And then I had to pull it. So now I've removed that feature. So that's pretty bad experience for members of the community who get excited about seeing that something is coming and then learn that it's not. So there's a few observations about it. The first thing is that this is why I'm slow at processing pull requests. Processing pull requests is incredibly hard for me. I need to understand exactly what it is that the person submitting the pull request is trying to do, and then I need to pretty much implement that thing for myself in order to be confident that the solution that's being submitted is workable. So, you know, from the outside, it might look as though pull requests, what's there to not love? You get handed to you on a tray a desirable modification to the code. But what I'm saying is that that in fact an incoming pull request represents a lot of work for me. I have to test it and verify it, and doing that requires, you know, thinking through everything that it could possibly do. So that was first observation, that there's a good example of what goes wrong with processing pull requests and why I am reasonably conservative about processing pull requests, and why I take such a firm line about backwards compatibility. To answer Alberto's specific question, as I said in the explanation just back there, it's impossible for the list widget to support the iterator variable. The reason why is because in order to update a variable within, sorry, somebody's got some background noise. I'm not sure who it is. I think it might be Ed. I'm going to mute you. Oh, whoever it was, it's gone. In order to set a new value for a variable within the widget tree, you have to refresh the whole subtree. So that means that we can't do what the list widget wants to do, which is to be able to update the value of a variable without doing a refresh. So we can make something that's similar to the list widget that does support iterators and that doesn't make any attempt to do selective refreshing or to handle, do the navigation handling that the current list widget does. So there's some discussion about this on GitHub, but it's basically this new widget with this iterator support. It looks from a distance that it's quite a lot like the list widget, but actually the vast majority of the mechanism of the list widget is concerned with this selective updating and with handling navigation, neither of which can or would be included in this new iterator-enabled equivalent of the list widget. So Alberto, I think, maybe watching. He's not here, so I don't know that Alberto, you can't confirm whether that made sense. But do let me know if you have any further questions. Does that make sense, everybody, guys here?
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, Jeds, just following on from what we've just been discussing, can we have a special list type widget that has that function? Yes, so that's what I'm proposing. And hopefully, I think Tobias may well take up the challenge of writing that widget. It's actually quite a good way to start because, as I say, a lot of what makes the list widget complicated is this selective updating handling. So a variant of the list widget that didn't do selective updating would be a good deal easier to work with. But yes, also you said, Jed says it's really useful, which I agree. The iterator function is really useful. And it's a shame it's worked out like that. Okay, the next topic I was going to pick up was a question that Nick was asking. So the background here is that in a discussion thread about a specific new filter, so there was a proposal on GitHub to introduce a new filter that copes with the situation when you're typing a search phrase. For the first 1, 2, or 3 characters, there's often a gazillion results that come back, which can slow the thing down. So what we wanted was a way to suppress the search unless a minimum number of characters had been typed. And anyway, on the GitHub ticket, which you can look at if you're interested, there's some discussion and proposals about how to do this. Implicit in that discussion is how to do it in a way that is backwards compatible, so it's a way that fits in with the current filter syntax. Nick jumped into the discussion with some interesting proposals about a slightly different syntax, I think it'd be fair to say, for doing the kinds of things that we currently do with the filter language. Now, I've got a very clear position on this. So the filter language is what it is. All we can do is extend it, and we can't change it. There's a massive constraint. There's a massive constraint for me, as well as for the other people who are trying to use filters and who find them occasionally confusing and difficult to use. But the problem is, I think, that all of the interesting and creative alternatives to what we've got require changes in the syntax. So I think what we really need that would enable us to make much more meaningful experiments with alternative filter languages is to figure out the best way to allow multiple is to figure out the best way. What am I trying to say? Sorry, I got sidetracked by what was going on in the sidebar there. Can somebody help me out?
The best way to keep a filter.
Oh yes, I'm so sorry, Nick. Thank you. You're doing a perfect job prompting me. So the issue was, thank you, Nathan. The issue was that we need to develop an escape syntax so that it would be possible to create a new type of plugin that implemented an alternative filter language. And then that would make it possible for us to experiment with, I think, the kinds of things that Nick and myself and others are interested in, which is exploring Lisp-like languages, Forth-like languages. There's a couple of interesting starting points for a much more internally consistent language for doing the same jobs as filters. So Nick, not to discourage you from the area you're noodling away at there, I think the filter language is absolutely a place that we could do with some attention. It's not, although I think those of you with a background with other sort of formal systems often find the haphazard nature of the filter language to be problematic. It's not very systematically designed. To me, that would be the primary problem, in fact. But I think we need to open that door. We need to figure out a decent extensibility mechanism. And there's a couple of options. So at the moment, all of the filters that are used within TiddlyWiki are passed to a widget as an attribute. And so you've got things like the list widget taking a filter attribute, which is a string, giving the filter. So one alternative, the simplest alternative, is for those widgets to take an alternative attribute with an alternative name for some other filter language. So you might say filter.forth equals, and then have a forth filter expression. Does that make sense? Another alternative would be to have to look for a magic initial character at the start of the filter string that, if found, leads into a sequence that determines the language. So, for instance, looking at my keyboard frantically, a @ wouldn't be a particularly common character to find at the start of a filter. So we could say that filter strings are preceded at the beginning of a filter string. There's the @ symbol, the name of the language, and a colon, and then the actual filter itself. And then we would be working on the basis that there'd be an @ symbol wiki filter or something by default for our current wiki filter syntax. Yeah, so I think that those are two possible approaches. I'm sure there are others. Let's get one of those figured out, think through the consequences, and then look at what plumbing we might need in the various places that use filters to be able to make the filter language switchable.
Yeah, my objection was that it has kind of thrown away a whole tradition of object-oriented language.
Deliberately, because object. I mean, you understand the issue is that it's a programming language designed for non-programmers. And I think the frustration is
Fine.
for those of us as a
But
programmer.
it doesn't lead from sort of the largest, you know, an object is addressed to do an action on a parameter, you know, from left to right. I mean, for left to right speaking people. Oh, that makes sense. And I suppose.
No, but it has its own. I mean, but it has its own internal logic. You know, I mean, the symbols, the operators in the filter language are processed left to right in order, so you can understand it in the order that you read it, if you see what I mean. But I mean, but of course, it's an unconventional approach.
Yeah, in my notes, I kind of drifted from the subject of filters per se into string parsing, and then brought in a whole series of stuff. I don't know whether you got into that, Jeremy, but
well, I mean, TiddlyWiki is a string parser. I mean, when I look at TiddlyWiki from a distance, what I see is machinery for parsing strings into trees.
Yeah. Well, may I show you something? I don't know if I can bring this up. And essentially, this was developed at IBM.
Look, Steve, I'm really sorry, but I think we should just full of the time. This is a rabbit hole that I don't really want to go down right now, because the thing is, we're a long way from the most important thing facing TiddlyWiki being to replace the filter language. As I said at the beginning, it is what it is. There are obstacles to TiddlyWiki's continued success. Yeah. My job is to focus on the ones that seem most important. In terms of filter languages, what I'm suggesting is a way in which some experimentation can carry on. Because at the moment, the problem is that there's a blocker that I can't accept modifications that make backwards incompatible changes. But really, beyond that, I think it's a bit of a specific topic to go into specific suggestions. I mean, all I can signpost is I'm very sympathetic, but as I say, jump back, because although the discussion about specific alternative filter syntax is interesting, it's kind of hypothetical unless we put ourselves in the position where we can experiment with these new languages.
Exactly.
And Nathan's just said in the corner a kind of similar thing, that the important part is to allow the experimentation, not to detail the experiments themselves just yet. And I think that's right. I mean, what I'd like to see is multiple. I mentioned Lisp and Forth. Forth is an interest that Nick and I share, but Lisp is, well, I think it's a very clunkily designed language syntactically, but it's much closer to the current filter language in terms of its kind of scope of operations.
Since there was some discussion about Mathy extension to be used within TiddlyWiki to make decisions, I looked up to see if there were any forks that were implemented in JavaScript, and there are several, and whether they could be easily pulled into TiddlyWiki would be a very interesting proposition too, for later perhaps.
Yeah.
Now,
well,
is your philosophy that when you go to 4.0, will you still be backward compatible with everything that preceded it? Because otherwise, I think you're building yourself into a horrible trap.
Well, look, Nick, I mean, the timeline of TiddlyWiki is that TiddlyWiki Classic came out in 2004. TiddlyWiki 5 is the replacement version, that is not backwards compatible. So yes, I would be very interested in doing a non-backwards compatible version, but I think for me it would be sometime in the future. I'd encourage other people to look at it. I mean, when we have this discussion, this is cropped up on the GitHub recently, where Tobias was pointing out some inconsistencies in the ways that some of the filters worked and arguing very eloquently. that they were broken and that they should be fixed. In order to sort of give some context, I was pointing out that to me, TiddlyWiki is unbelievably imperfect. You know, it grew organically as I was exploring the problem space, and so when I look at it, at the problems with it, to me they're much more fundamental than any of the things that we're talking about here. So an example is that now I regret that the way that TiddlyWiki 5 inherits the same basic tiddler data model from TiddlyWiki Classic. So I think that was a big mistake. What we have in TiddlyWiki 5 that we also had in TiddlyWiki Classic was fields, some of which contain lists and some of which contain values. And an example of a field containing a list is a tag, and the title is an example of a field containing a value. What I realized when it was too late in TiddlyWiki 5 is that I should have modeled it in TiddlyWiki 5 as fields with single string values, but that a tiddler could have multiple fields with the same value. And that's not such a JavaScripty model, but it's a perfectly consistent internal model. And it regularizes the treatment of tags and the other list-based fields with the ordinary text fields. And I've done enough thinking about it to be really annoyed. But I think that if I had gone down that road, a number of other things to do with the way that we deserialize fields, for instance, a number of the other bits of internal machinery would be radically simplified. So the kind of the moral of the story there is that I think the nature of a big complicated bundle of software like TiddlyWiki is that it's easy. I mean, we try and make it as easy as possible to make small incremental improvements to components of it, but that there's a big chunk, and I don't really know how to categorize these two chunks. A big chunk of potential changes that basically it's too late. It's the sad. It makes me happy to write software mostly because one's making progress against the mountain in front of you. But one of the downsides of writing software is that one's also embodied a concrete commitment in code, which then constrains us. So, my reflections on all of this is that maybe in a year or two, maybe I'll go off into the jungle and think more seriously about TiddlyWiki 10. But for the moment, I think it's an area that might be easier for other people to experiment with. When I did TiddlyWiki, I've been paying attention to compatibility, even though we advertise carefully that TiddlyWiki 5 isn't compatible with TiddlyWiki Classic in the sense that an end user expects. In another sense, it's very carefully created to be as compatible as possible, and so that so that wiki text can be transformed from one to the other. So all of this is a kind of tempting area that I try and resist jumping into too much. And I think Nick, I think you're displaying your background as a programmer, as somebody who's got some experience of other similar tools, and I think you're going down a path that lots of other people go down as well. Tobias has expressed great frustration with the limitations of the filter system as well, but we are where we are. Any other thoughts on that topic, Nick? Anybody else?
Well, I mean, the project could be forked, and
yes, that's what I mean about it being
do whatever we like with it.
But you see, I think even if you did that, you'd be better off starting from scratch. I mean, what I'd like to see, if I was, is somebody else go down, a new from scratch route. A fork would, it'd only be worth doing if you're going to keep backwards compatibility, I think. I mean, upstream compatibility.
Yeah.
Anyway, a fork. We should be so lucky as to have forks.
Jeremy.
Hello, Eric. Sorry, I didn't get to say hello.
Well, I'll just say hello. You know me. That's me. Okay, I'm done. All right, so Jeremy, I think in this discussion, one of the things I find is that the people who get most intrigued by TiddlyWiki are somewhat technical. And at the moment, at least, that they get grabbed by the technical possibilities, and they start saying, "Oh, can I get my favorite syntax or my preferred language style or something like that?"
Mm-hmm.
And they see a lot of excitement in the data model and in the filtering power and all that sort of stuff, but that the target audience that TiddlyWiki purports to be, aimed at, is much less technical.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, in writing inside TiddlyWiki, I find myself thinking about all the wonderful power of filters and how to say how great TiddlyWiki is, and then I think, no, I'm not going to even mention filters or even widgets until book 2, because there's so much to get through for. So that the kind of rarefied functionality we're talking about here. It's sort of like at one level, we need to simply make this a very solid tool for people to manipulate their information. And at another level, we need to make it a very solid tool for people who want to model their information and be very sophisticated in the way they want to do it. And I think that these two goals are actually a little bit at odds with each other, and that's what we're running into here, is that the desire to make this thing very powerful and at the same time make it very simple, it's very difficult to get both of those into the same bucket.
It is, yeah. I mean, this is something that's come up before in these discussions, is that in doing the TiddlyWiki 5 development, and particularly in trying to figure out what needed to be done in order for us to say it was the end of the beta. The big driver for a lot of that was a basic set of end-user functionality that I had in mind that didn't involve any customization. So it's basically the ability to create tiddlers, to create links, to create tags, to navigate tigs and lanks, to navigate links and tags, and the functionality that you see there. And then there's been me focused very much on that, on making things like control panel be reasonable. And then there's been a bunch of features like, I don't know, magic variables that the list widget understands in order to URI encode the targets of links. That are I think that those are features on a spectrum that speaks to what Eric is talking about, that there's absolutely nobody in the group articulating the needs for basic functionality. So as I was finishing up TiddlyWiki prior to the end of the beta, what people in the group were asking for was things like, can we do numeric calculations within filters? Can we do, all this kind of extending the functionality? And I was just trying to focus on making sure that we had reasonable messages if you accidentally overwrote another tiddler, that kind of thing. So I've always felt that part of my job in the middle of TiddlyWiki is to say, is to remind people, that's probably the word, that there's a bunch of stuff that is best to happen in plugins.
Yeah.
And that's where projects like TiddlyWiki win, because once people realize that and they move, then innovation moves more into the plugin space, and we stop looking to the core for innovation. And the core, really, when you think about what we need from a strong TiddlyWiki core, the very last thing we need from it is innovation. We need it to be solid and reliable and fast, and to not change, and to be as small as possible, those kinds of things. And all of making more deep changes in the way that TiddlyWiki works will tend to compromise those goals.
Can I ask you a question? You suggested with my perhaps misguided effort to reformat the documentation to make it read more like poetry or whatever, you said to post it on a certain site, which apparently only takes TiddlyWiki Classic.
No, that was, sorry, we did cover this on email, Nick. I'd suggested putting it on Tiddly Spot.
Yes.
S-P-O-T.
Okay.
The site that you were looking at, I think, must have been Tiddly Space.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Tiddly Spot,
my mistake.
if you go to tiddlyspot.com, you get instructions for TiddlyWiki Classic, but if you go to tiddlywiki.com, you will get Tiddly Spot instructions and search for Tiddly Spot. You'll find Tiddly Spot instructions for TiddlyWiki 5.
Thank
you. Let us move on if there's no more last-minute thoughts from any of that. Those were supposed to be our brief
Jeremy,
kickoff discussions.
Just for folks who may not be familiar with the two, although I think everyone here is probably, just to clarify, Tiddly Spot works on a file-by-file basis, so that each Tiddly Spot you set up is a separate TiddlyWiki document. And they don't talk to each other, basically. Tiddly Space is a server-side resource that assembles TiddlyWiki documents on the fly from tiddlers stored separately on the server. And it has the ability to have ownership and exchange of automatic inheritance of tiddlers from other spaces, and so it's a much more elaborate mechanism. Tiddly Spot is more like a place to host your document with some automatic tools for getting it set up, whereas Tiddly Space is a complete server-based Tiddly system.
That's right. I mean, in fact, the way I like to think about it is, and you almost said these exact words, that Tiddly Spot is oriented around wiki documents, around HTML files, and Tiddly Space is oriented around individual tiddlers. And yeah,
more like Mode.js.
I did post the link for an SVG where I tried to make this a little bit more visible. It's about the structure of a file TiddlyWiki, Tiddly Spot, Tiddly Space, and then the Node.js server. So there is a lot of errors and things. But yeah, just another approach to make it more visible how the different versions of TiddlyWiki work.
And here is the diagram that Mario just talked about, which I haven't seen before. I think this diagram there is potentially a great illustration of what I perceive to be a bit of a problem, which is that in my head, I often use sort of boxes and lines between them to kind of visualize what's going on. But I find when one commits diagrams in that form to paper, once they get over a certain level of complexity, they're very hard to comprehend. And I think that's the case here, Mario, as well, when you say that.
Yeah, in normal cases, you go from left to right. Yeah, you have a file TiddlyWiki, then I need to click it. Then you have Tiddly Spot, and then TiddlyWeb. And then, yeah, I don't know, about several weeks ago, I added the Node.js thing. So it's a little bit more, well, yeah, let's say complicated, but I think it actually displays how it works. Yeah?
Yes, I mean, I find diagrams like this, I mean, the problem with it is that you've had to actually invent some conventions that one needs to learn in order to parse the diagram.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's obviously a hallmark of a diagram that is, therefore its role in educating users has got to be quite far down the path. It's not something that we can use to summarize, perhaps. So I think it's more than to teach.
No offense to Mario and his efforts at diagramming, but it reminds me very much of those examples in the Edward Tufte books about chart junk.
Oh, well, no, that's slightly unfair, actually, because chart junk is a very specific criticism about putting decoration on.
Fair enough. It's not the chart junk so much as the sort of like, I'm not sure which dimensions are what here. I see some dotted lines dividing things up, but I'm not sure what they're dividing per se. And and I see some arrows underneath things and some arrows on top of things, and so I'm not sure if the layering means something or if that's just an aspect of they were hard to draw.
Yeah, this is because this one single diagram is out of context now.
Yeah.
So I should have pointed to the Google group post where there is some explanation how you should read it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, Mario. It sounds like we're all tearing up your diagram. For me, the depth of passion that I have about this topic is, as I say, my frustration that lines and boxes diagrams beguile us by thinking that they're a good way to model the world, but actually, when we get them down on paper, they defy ordinary human attempts at understanding. Well, so you can see that for me, this is the central problem that TiddlyWiki is trying to solve as well. So when I look at a diagram like this, the kinds of tools that I think might make it easier to learn or teach would be things like progressively revealing the diagram, being able to highlight particular chunks. Yes, exactly, that kind of thing, which is more like, imagine giving the user a diagram like that and then giving them the tools to slice and dice and experiment with it themselves. So I'm not talking about, I mean, obviously, clearly there is a place for explanatory animations, that could be commissioned or designed to illustrate this stuff. But as I say, I'm more interested in Mario being able to hand over a diagram like this in a form that I can view where it's much more fluid in the same way. So I guess to make a more explicit analogy with TiddlyWiki says cut your information up into chunks, and then we can have multiple stories that thread those chunks together. And I think that put like that also applies to these types of diagrams, that you could imagine the chunks that make up the diagram being aggregated in different ways to tell different stories, and particularly different slices of this story, because going across from left to right, there's in fact it's independent scenarios for using TiddlyWiki, and isolating those would make it easier to understand those individual scenarios. Anyway, so Mario, sorry to be tearing your diagram apart. It's a great diagram of exactly the sort that I like playing with myself as well. So next topic was to talk about this stacked view. So this is something I did since last week, since the Hangout last week. I was ended up having to be on various trains on Wednesday and Thursday last week, and so had a bit of developer time when I wasn't on the internet, and for some reason this was the topic that jumped into my head to try and explore. So in terms of, this is an example of something that is quite a big change to TiddlyWiki. It's not just a little tweak. It's adding a whole new component that works slightly differently than the existing components. What I like to do in that case is to create some kind of prototype as quickly as possible, ideally a couple of hours or less, otherwise I would get bored. And so that's what I did with the plugin library stuff, and that's what I did with this stacked view stuff. Then, of course, what you find is you got this really big spike at the beginning, 2 hours, and you got something vaguely up and running. And then, of course, it takes 10 times that to make the next perceptible improvement. And any further improvements after that first prototype, a lot of the work tends to be redoing the things that you'd done in a hand-to-mouth way in the prototype.
The law of diminishing returns.
Exactly, and it's maddening. So what is the stacked view? It's an attempt to try to deal with a fundamental concern with TiddlyWiki, which is that people are puzzled by the basic navigation behavior. So we've got two commonly used story views. We've got the classic story view, where tiddlers are shown one after the other. If I click on a link to a new tiddler, it inserts immediately after the one that I clicked within, and I can scroll up and down to navigate them. We also provide the zoom-in view, which just shows a single tiddler at a time, so when I close one, another tiddler will take its place. Now, the zoom-in story view has some very specific issues. If I close a tiddler, the tiddler I go back to isn't always the tiddler that I would expect. And yeah, a few issues.
Raising the question of buttons back and forth.
Well, the browser has backwards and forwards buttons.
Yeah.
So I mean, at the moment, I don't know if you know this, Nick, but you can set TiddlyWiki to update the history particularly, and if you have the history updated, then the browser backwards and forwards buttons will work. But what I've found with the browser buttons is that the trouble is that people simultaneously expect the back button to navigate within TiddlyWiki, and they expect the back button to take them back to the previous site. So when we've changed the defaults experimentally, we've had both bits of feedback go quite forcefully, actually, which is problematic. Anyway, so of the two views, the classic story view is the one that TiddlyWiki Classic has. What I like about it is the way that as I click on links, I end up having unfolded my own story that's my own sequence of tiddlers, and I can scroll back up and read back down to see how I got there. So for me, it can work quite nicely for reading some types of material. However,
it suggests that you could make an outline of things you open and so forth. You know what I mean? Realize it on the right as a kind of an outline that would.
In the table of contents.
You'd be in there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Nick, actually, I've been working on using the tabbed table of contents as part of my Inside TiddlyWiki display, and I find that using zoom-in mode there actually is very advantageous because I'm working in a very hierarchical way. That I've set it up so that I can go from the tabbed contents to an individual tiddler to edit it. And then simply by closing the tiddler I was editing on, I'm now back at the place where the contents were. So if you're working in a very hierarchical way where you're walking down a branch and then backing out very cleanly, and I'm finding that that's a pattern that I use very regularly. So for me, it's not that much of a difficulty about sort of getting lost in a twisty little maze of passages all alike.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the classic story view, been around for ages. The zoom-in story view was new to TiddlyWiki 5. As it's turned out, it served two roles. One is that if I do the animation duration, that it does this quite funky zooming into links, which
worked beautifully for your tutorial.
Exactly, which we use very nicely in the introduction tiddler. And if you turn the animation right down to 0, whoops, then zoom-in view behaves like a standard wiki, pretty much, modulo the fact that when I close a tiddler, it doesn't go back to the one that I was expecting. But the problem that I have with with using the zoom-in story view like this, is that it hides the history. There's no easy way. I click on permalinks. There's no easy way for me to get back to where I was other than to close the tiddler that I'm on. So that's kind of, you don't get that ability to look over the hedge to see where you are. So the stacked view is an attempt to have to counteract that by giving us very much the same behavior as the zoom-in view, except to show the stack of tiddlers that we've navigated through. Where I am with it at the moment is I'm just let me get rid of that message. Is I'm doing this, making it so that you can adjust the height of what I call. Let me refresh because we had animation turned off.
Yeah, the point of view.
So there's this I'm calling the fan, and if I change it to 100, there you can see it goes down. Change it to 400, so it's big. So the idea, and if I change it down to -10, then you can see it goes back to almost the same as the zoom-in view before.
It suggests you could put ears on them, like file hangers, you know, in a filing cabinet. Put little ears on them to distinguish them.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes. Like with sort of, in fact, a little bit like that ribbon. Do you mean only at the top, so that you could look across the top of them to see? Yes. Yeah. So I've often thought about tags being like that, as an overlapping ribbon on the outside. So
may I ask? I didn't fill with this. Can you reorder things by grabbing the one on the back and pulling it forward?
No, what I've done just recently is made it so you can click. So you can't drag, but you can click.
Yeah, good. I mean, the same thing. I mean,
so what's the bit that's really lacking is, you know, if you've got a lot of tiddlers open, then you might want to fan them that far apart so that you can clearly distinguish their titles. And yet, for normal use.
Can you fly back over the stack? Fly back over history.
You certainly could, but that's not something I've.
But it's not
at the moment. Yeah. I mean okay, so it's
very nice.
Of making it practical. The immediate concern is finding a sensible way for the user to. So I was using JavaScript, the JavaScript console, to trigger, you know, the different heights of the fan, and the user needs to be able to click on something to do that. That's actually a very hard problem because the story views are switchable, and when I change the story view, it doesn't change anything else. It doesn't add new user interface elements to TiddlyWiki, because we've got the several things that need to be independently changeable. There's the story view and the theme, and they can be independently switched. So it's the domain of the theme to add new visual elements. The story view is concerned with animating the DOM elements that make up the story river. So,
but Jeremy, do you think that there are that there are many changes to this setting? I think if there is one input box in the control panel, then it's enough, because at the very beginning you play a little bit with it, and when you like it, you're done.
No, then we're not quite seeing things the same. What I'm saying is that I believe that we need a way to be able to interactively switch between a view like that, where the tiddlers are fanned out and I can see their titles, and a view like that where they're not fanned out. So, for instance, being able to click on a little button here and then all to go floop, so that I can then see the titles and select the one that I want. I mean, I can select them without seeing the titles, but obviously that's less useful. So I'm suggesting, what I'm saying is hard at the moment is that in order to give the user interactive control over the height of the fan, there needs to be some kind of doohickey that the user clicks upon. And the issue is that story views can't add new user interface elements at the moment, at any rate. Therefore, because the story view is only concerned with animating the DOM elements that are already in the story. So the best we could do is things like adding event handlers to those DOM elements. But the trouble with that is clearing them up afterwards, dealing with the fact that I can spontaneously switch to a different story view, and at that point, of course, we'd need to remove all of those event handlers.
Yeah, but then make it a new theme.
But then that breaks the thing I was saying, which is that the theme and the story view can be independently selected.
Yeah, but then it's not a story view; it's a theme. So.
Well, I believe that the solution is to. I think there's lots of scenarios where a story view needs user interface elements. So, for instance, another one would be Cecily, where most of what you see on the screen here maps directly onto the TiddlyWiki 5 story view. It's just a sequence of divs, with styling. But this guy is specific to the Cecily view, and something like it is definitely needed. There are controls like zooming that, okay, maybe we can support pinch zooming, but we need just like Google Maps, we need an explicit zoom control. So that's the challenge I'm trying to figure out, is the best way to make that possible so that a story view can add user interface furniture. So one of the changes that I made to do this is to add keyboard support. So I've changed the template so that there's now a tab index assigned to the div that we call the tiddler frame div, the div that contains a complete tiddler in the story view. A consequence of adding the tab index is that I can now select it. So in Chrome, this is the keyboard select indicator rectangle, and it's a sort of glowing blue circle. A glowing blue rectangle. If in Firefox, when again, let me switch to the normal classic view. So if I click on a guy, you can see the border change. It gets a sort of black dotted border. It's not actually tremendously noticeable. The advantage of this is that now I can use the standard browser keyboard shortcuts to navigate between the tiddlers. So this is the precursor to something that's been wanted for a while, which is the ability to have keyboard shortcuts on tiddlers that are in view mode. So now that we have the ability to focus a particular tiddler, to give it the keyboard focus, if I was to press, I don't know, Control Y to delete the current tiddler, it would no longer be ambiguous which tiddler was being referred to.
What happens when, with a blank view where they're all mixed together, the rectangle still appears?
What do you mean by a blank view?
There's one of the views, or that.
The seamless.
You mean like this?
Where it's all one blank page, where the tiddlers are not separated by a background.
Oh, do you mean the seamless theme?
Yes, the theme, yes.
Right, well, that goes back to what we were saying, that has no interactions with the story view. So, I mean, the stacked one becomes, I don't know, in some ways, look, if I take the height down again, it's not so bad, but I don't know, I'm not sure that, I mean, that seamless view is rather, I don't know.
I like this, but I would like it even more if you could just shuffle the cards into the order that you wanted them.
Yeah, well, there is an outstanding ticket, as I'm sure you're aware, for drag and drop of the list widget, which, amongst other things, would allow the story river to be reordered. Now, I'm just going to talk a little about.
Tell me, can you select the first one and then navigate back?
Right. So I think maybe you might be. So I'm doing
something like this. Yeah.
I'm doing Shift Tab to go back, and I don't know if you saw that, but I went from working with TiddlyWiki, went back, and it went to the browser address bar. So this is in fact a problem with this keyboard shortcut stuff. That for the stacked view, when I click on something to bring it to the front, we don't change the order of the tiddlers in the story. We instead use the Z index. So that means that now, having done some clicking on some tiddlers, if I now tab through them, the order that it steps through is pretty random. Oh, no, it's over on the sidebar.
Ah, okay, okay.
So that's something I need to fix, and there's a I think I can see a way to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But the general gist of it is to replace the current zoom-in view. I mean, I'm not going to remove the zoom-in view, and there will continue to be things that the zoom-in view does that this one doesn't do particularly.
Augment it, yeah.
But I think that this, when it's in this mode, where the fan is either reduced in size or invisible, is pretty much equivalent to the zoom-in view, but you do get this additional affordance of being able to visualize the stack of tiddlers that you're on.
Tell me, do you get the hover event at the DOM element in this view? So I was thinking about if you make it smaller, so let's say 50 or 70.
Yeah.
If you make the event 70, and then if you hover with the mouse,
no, not at the moment, but that's
then pop up the title.
That's also the thought, is that as I riffle up and down here, the titles should appear, so that I don't need to open it if I don't want to.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But you get the hover event, so it's
tooltips.
Well, actually, no, not tooltips. I'm suggesting that the actual tiddler itself would move to reveal, reveal the title, if possible. Only because I'm sure you guys have,
as a filing cabinet.
As a UI guy, which I barely am, I grew up on the work of Alan Cooper, who codified in the 90s the user interface rules that were embodied by the Mac and Windows and so on. And one of the things that he writes about is the direct manipulation metaphor. And it's left a residue with me where the ideal goal is of TiddlyWiki is that it implements that same direct manipulation idea, so that everything that you do within TiddlyWiki should be done by manipulating the visual representation of a tiddler or a link, and not be too indirect. So.
Well, that would imply that you should be able to drag the list on the right into the order you would like to.
Yes, that's the list widget reordering thing that we would like, absolutely. And we'd like to be able to reorder for a tag. We'd like to be able to reorder the tiddlers that carry that tag. You know how we've got tags as a mechanism throughout.
Or the tags within each tiddler.
No, ordering the tags within a tiddler doesn't seem to be useful. So there is an ordering to the tags on a tiddler, but at the moment that ordering isn't regarded as significant.
But it would be if it represented a hierarchy, and to the left is a root and going.
Yeah, but no, look, we've been through this before. What you want is breadcrumbs. So the tags that you want listed aren't the tags that are carried by the target tiddler. They're the parent tags in the tag hierarchy that lead to that tiddler. And as we've discussed before, the table of contents macro establishes a way to do that. I think Jed might even have offered last week to have a look at it. But so there's no obstacle to doing that. You can just do it. There's nothing that's needed in the core, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So the one frustration is, you may remember back in December, the new feature moratorium, and the stacked view is, of course, a new feature. But I'm dealing with it slightly differently than other new features in the past. So what's happening right now is that well, as I said, I've kind of done the exciting bit of the stacked view, and now it's lots of slog to get things like that hovering working, for instance. So rather, what I've done is put the stacked view code in a separate fork, just as a TiddlyWiki contributor would. So that means that anybody who wants to play around with the stacked view code can do so just by checking out that fork. But it means that the main master can carry on without being delayed by it. So the stacked view may not even go into 5.1.8. I think that's one of the things that we need to think about, really, is whether it's worth putting it in a potentially unfinished form, or whether it's better to keep the stacked view up our sleeves until we get it to the point where it's doing everything that we can envisage it doing. And yeah, well, it's perhaps a good introduction to the topic I was suggesting, which is that we talk about the release of 5.1.8. But before we switch, anybody got anything about the stacked view? Any observations, questions, thoughts?
Only in that to reiterate, the folders and a filing cabinet seem to be a desirable way of handling it.
Did you say folders?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Folder with
I mean,
little shape, changing the shape from a rectangle to putting it little.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. Putting those little, what are those called? Those little thumbs.
Tabs.
Yeah, tabs. Not that that's an overloaded phrase for us.
Yeah, surely, yes.
Okay, so 5.1.8. The situation that we are in at the moment is that 5.1.7 came out on the 19th of December, hot on the heels of 5.1.6. That was the same day, but there was a minor problem with 5.1.6 that led to 5.1.7. So that means that now it's nearly 2 months. So I think we're getting to the point where 5.1.8 should go out. And the question, I guess, is how there's still quite a lot of stuff on the drawing board and sort of various stages of completion. How much of that stuff are we going to pick up and address? As I say, the main bit in my mind is what to do about the stacked story view. My inclination is to leave that till 5.1.9 to get a 5.1.8 that's essentially what you see now on the current pre-release, plus some cleaning up.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, did you switch the languages into their own editions, or?
Yes, I haven't done all of that. So this is the I've taken all the other languages out of the main index.html, but I need to create build scripts for each of the other languages. So at the moment we've only got language additions for some languages, and not consistently all of them.
Okay.
But that's one of the areas that I think needs to be looked at. And there was something else on my mind. That was my list. Oh yes, a very funny one that some time ago we experimentally added icons for certain system tiddlers, such as the control panel and the tag manager and advanced search. And when those were first done, I was saying that I didn't think that I really liked it very much, that I thought it made things a bit visually complex. But I think I'm kind of changing my mind now that I've had it. Now that we've had it for a few weeks, I think I've just kind of got used to it.
I think there is one important thing for new users. They don't know the difference, so they just don't care. I think it's just for those users who already use TiddlyWiki, which will recognize it. But if you're really new to TiddlyWiki, then you don't know it in a different way, so there shouldn't be a big problem.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I do wonder whether part of the problem isn't that they're black, but that they. I think we did do some experimentation with this, but that maybe them being paler might help. So something. Yeah, like that. So they're more like the color of the system text, the $:/.
Yeah.
So anyway, I haven't really thought through the timing, and I've got a fairly tricky week, but maybe next week we might go for 5.1.8. So for everybody else, I think if you've got anything that you particularly want to see in 5.1.8, this is the time to file a ticket. Let me know, and yeah, we'll figure out the details on GitHub. Okay, I think I had one more. Yeah, so I've got one more topic, which is a new one that we haven't discussed at the Hangouts before. So before we turn to it, let's just ask if there's anybody else got anything else that they want to discuss. I can see Nathan saying you got a minor bug report. Would you like to share that with us, Nathan?
Sure, yes. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick.
Great.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. This is, I'm not sure if this has come up before, but it's a kind of just a little minor bug that Sarah actually stumbled upon and showed me. I thought it was pretty cute. So I'm just going to open a tiddler in the edit template here, and I'm going to open a second tiddler in the edit template here. And I'm just going to go and start adding a tag to this tiddler, and we can see down here it's showing the tag being added to the second tiddler. Now, when I actually add it, it only saves on the first tiddler, but
yeah,
it shows the state in both tiddlers being edited. Just a little odd.
Yes, isn't it? There's a
why it's happening, but it's certainly unintuitive for users that don't know why it's happening.
There's a ticket for a closely related one, which is that if you type into the add a new field box, you'll see that the text appears in the other tiddlers about a new field name box as well. Does that make sense? So it's reusing the same string in each case. The reason for it is because I did that bit first before we had this idea of qualified tiddler titles. So for some time I was wrestling with the problem of how each individual tiddler could have separate state, and eventually came up with the qualification mechanism. So it didn't have it, so therefore things like that, the name of the current field is just stored in a tiddler with a given title, rather than being stored in a tiddler whose title is derived from the from the position of the tiddler within the widget tree. So it's a really easy fix. All we need to do is whack in some qualifying macros. It's quite easy.
All right, well, I just thought I would bring it up, make sure that you were aware of it and whatnot. So.
Well, it's yeah, it's a sort of yes, it's a little weird thing that it would be quite good to get sorted out. Anybody else? Anything else?
Yeah, I noticed in one of the themes, and I can't find it, that the banner, the 45-degree angle banner at the top right, gets duplicated.
Right, that happens when you are looking at the tool, when you have the tool tab open on the right. So if I close this, and there, as soon as I do that, do you see you get the second version down there?
Yeah.
And the reason is because TiddlyWiki.com abuses the toolbar button to pretend that this banner is one of those toolbar buttons. And so, like the rest of the toolbar buttons, it repeats the toolbar button here as the label for the button. And so here, that means that you've got a second copy of the GitHub ribbon. So the solution is that the GitHub ribbon shouldn't be pretending to be a button, because it's not.
Yes. Begs up another question rapidly. Is there a way quickly to avoid scrolling so much by having the controls down at the bottom, or having a viewport where the controls are always present?
Yeah, we talked about this again before, Nick. You showed a prototype for a toolbar across the bottom of the screen. And yeah, there's nothing stopping that being done.
Okay. It would be very helpful.
So, well, you might have seen Ton Herner has shared a guide to creating a top bar, which is, obviously up there. To adapt it to be a bottom bar is one slip of CSS.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I showed you before that an earlier prototype of TiddlyWiki had a position fixed toolbar.
Okay.
The reason why I abandoned it for TiddlyWiki.com is that for some time I've been trying to make TiddlyWiki.com in its default presentation more resemble a web page than a web application.
Yeah, are frames deprecated at this point?
What kind of frames?
HTML frames.
What do you mean?
Where a section of the screen can be, or arbitrary portions of the screen can be made into separate HTML entities.
Okay, you mean frames that come from a different site?
Well, or from, yeah. I mean,
well, the purpose of a frame in HTML or an iframe is to include, almost like transcluding, material from another site. If you're in the same site, there's two frames here that independently scroll, but they're not iframes or frames in the sense that you mean. They're just divs with scrolling behavior.
But I mean, I was thinking, well, the business on the very top right, if that were put in a static frame, then it would also be available.
Well, I think that's another way of saying, can't we have a toolbar that's always available?
Yes.
So look, as I say, I mean,
I know. I don't want to go around on it, but
I don't want to be unhelpful about this. It's TiddlyWiki. The default theme and the default appearance is what it is. If I change that, if we change the default theme, we have to change every bit of documentation and so on. So don't frame it as, Jeremy, can you change the TiddlyWiki core so that it does this? Okay. There is, what you want is Jeremy, can I have a plugin that does this? Okay. And then I'm not necessarily the man to make the plugin, but I can tell you whether it's possible.
Yeah. Well, I vote for such a plugin, put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I think Jeds.
I made the icon menus thing. There's a link to it in the sidebar. It does almost exactly what you want. from what I understand. And there should be everything you need to import that there. You can change all the settings in the control panel, and it will give you a nice little bar across the top or on the sides. And if you really want one on the bottom of the screen, I can put one on the bottom of the screen. And that should do what you want.
Okay, Jed. Well, it's very good that you've brought this up. This is, I think, it's some time since we looked at this. So this is a demonstrating, I'm guessing, a plugin. No, not yet a plugin, but a series of tweaks, modules, and templates, and so on. And we can choose different types of bars. Good Lord.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Okay, so right pop out on hover, I can make it so that... Okay, maybe it's interacting with the OS X ID menu in a weird way. So it's highly configurable. Good Lord.
That's what I did when I was in France. I did not have access to my normal computer. I was stuck in Starbucks and without speaking the language, so I had some time.
This is really nice, Jen. Again, I'm very impressed that you've not only made customizations, but that you have you provided customizations. You provided a user interface for the user to customize things to a degree that's really quite interesting.
Where would this be available?
At the URL that you can see up there.
I think I might have made a plugin somewhere, but I don't. Oh yeah, on in my socks website that I did, it is not turned on there. But if you go into the More menu and the System part, there is the plugin there that you can import. I haven't actually listed anywhere, I don't think. Oh no, it's actually under my plugins on in my socks.tiddlyspot.com. There is a little link to the plugin there, and it is packaged as a plugin.
Excellent. Okay, wow. Jed, you might get the prize for the number of plugins that you've created for TiddlyWiki, because it's quite a lot here. I noticed you're on 5.1.6. Is that just because... Oh no, some bits are 5.1.6 and some bits are 5.1.7. That may be worth looking at. It'd be quite good to keep it consistent, I guess.
Oh yeah, I hadn't updated the my local copy of the Git repository for a lot of them, and you need to update a lot of things.
Another thing that Jed's got that I've don't know if we've ever mentioned in a Hangout is quite a good solution to an eternal problem, which is that I chose what I thought was a reasonable width for the story river based on at the font size that we use, trying to have a readable number of words per line. There's a bit of, I think it might be you, Jed, is it still your heater in the background?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Oh, so sorry, Jed. What was I on?
Select the plugins.
About the width and the number of words.
Oh yes, that's right. Of course, yeah. Sorry. So I chose a fixed width. Then we expose in theme tweaks. We expose a text box that allows you to about a number of text boxes that allows you to change that width. So if I change it to 800 and 800, then I get and I need to change the width of the tiddlers as well, and so I get a slightly wider story river. And what Jed's done that I quite like is a quite an obtrusive button, but I think it kind of has to be, because at least at this point, none of us have ever seen this button before. So what happened to me was, I think I first went to one of Jed's wikis when the width was maybe set like that or like that by default, much wider than my narrow screen. But this is incredibly easy to discover, and it doesn't take you long to realize that that's what you need to do. So, I mean, as ever in the core, I would like to be able to just drag that position, you know, to drag there, to resize. But pending that, I think that this is quite a nice pragmatic solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a 27-inch monitor.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm wasting a lot of space unless I diddle around with the numbers to increase the river width. It'd be nice to have columns for readability.
I don't know if we've probably not talked about federated wiki for a while, but federated wiki, smallest federated wiki, which is Ward Cunningham's work, does use this multi-column display in a similar way to what I have in mind. But it's, well, in fact, it's not quite the same. I clicked on About Plugins, and About Plugins opens there. If I click on a different link, it replaces that one. So this is, in fact, a stack of pages, not, you know, as in LIFO stack, and not really exactly the same as the Story River in TiddlyWiki. But
and
yeah.
They're not wrapped columns either.
Say again, sorry?
They're, that is to say, like a magazine where you read one column.
Oh, I see. No, I wouldn't be doing that because the web doesn't really do that very nicely. So it would be more for side-by-side working. So, you know, the original...
comparisons or whatever.
Well, one of the observations that drove the development of TiddlyWiki was that what makes a wiki useful is that it's refactored, and that the canonical refactoring operations involve more than one tiddler at once. So you want to be able to have multiple ones on screen at once, and that was the driver for the classic view you see in TiddlyWiki today. But of course, TiddlyWiki Classic was done in the days of 1024 by 768 screens, and now we got these super wide screens.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have done a sideways view sooner than the stacked view, but the I'm always trying to, the attraction of the stacked view over this sideways view is, I think, that I'm trying to make something that's easy to comprehend for a beginner. And I think the stacked view does a good job of communicating what's going on, where the sideways view, well, it's not going to be that much different than the classic view, just as the classic view leaves people puzzled as to where a new tiddler will open. A sideways view is going to leave people puzzled as to where a new tiddler is going to open. So let's unshare the screen. So that was, I think, actually now all the topic. Yeah, no, I've still got one topic left to quickly discuss. But the main things that I wanted to discuss was the stacked view, and to discuss the release of 5.1.8. So the other thing I was just going to signpost was an issue that I think we've rather kind of glossed over, and I just wanted to show you that I'm paying attention to it. So the issue is this, that TiddlyWiki 5 now has a number of built-in core images. So core images, those button. So so here I'm transcluding that tiddler, and including, this is the close button text afterwards. That tiddler contains an image, so I get the image in it. And if we go and look at the tiddler in question, so that's the tiddler we're transcluding, you can see that if we go in to look at it, that there's this is a wiki text SVG image. So that's to say the content type is wiki text. So that means that I can do things, I can do wiki text things like transclusion, but that it actually contains SVG elements. So these are DOM elements that map onto an SVG image. The parent element is the SVG element itself, and you'll see it includes a width and height. And that's actually the width and height that the image is displayed at. So if I change those numbers, and that you can see that the image resized in the place where I've transcluded it. So that's reasonable. I can go back and edit the source of an image in order to change its size. But the problem is that very often we want to resize an image at the point where we use it. So now there is the wiki text image syntax. So if I do something like that, that references an SVG tiddler. So if I look at the source here, you'll see a critical difference. This guy is an image tag containing the image of the cat as a base 64 data URI, whereas the X image here is an inline SVG. Now the value of an inline SVG is that we can recolor it with CSS. So if I go, well, if I can do it here, so if I just go fill red, then the cross turns red. And if I select the image of the cat and try and do that, it doesn't, because the CSS in the page doesn't affect the styling of the actual image itself. So at the moment, things like when we use these icons over in the sidebar for these buttons, you can see the SVG element still has width and height of 22 points, but we've got some CSS giving that SVG a width and height of 1em. So if I remove those bits of styling, you can see that those images have all gone back to their natural size, as in 22 points.
But so, SVG doesn't have a scaling factor?
Yes, it does. It has incredibly complicated scaling rules. So with SVG, the view box determines the rectangle within the coordinate system established by the image that is visible, and then the width and height is the extrinsic width and height that is used for compositing the image. So the issue I'm getting at here is that we would, so with the image wiki text, I can say width equals 100. And I get a resized image.
Oh, bless you, and that looks very nice.
But I can't do that with a transcluded one. And if we look at the output of the transcluded, we see why. Because at the point, that transclusion is equivalent to this. But there is no way to give it a width and height. So now you might think, well, Jeremy, all you need to do is to give a width and height to the transclude widget. But the trouble is, the transclude widget doesn't generate any DOM nodes, so therefore there is nothing to assign that width and height to. Plus, if it did generate a DOM node, at best it would be a div, and resizing a div that contains an SVG won't do anything to resize the content. So what I'm signposting is that I think that because of the way we've been using the images at the moment, so all of the images are used within the TiddlyWiki user interface, therefore it's perfectly straightforward to size them with CSS. But if I just want to include an image within my text and have control over the size, at the moment, there's no easy way to do that. We've also...
Jeremy, can't you create a macro that does cover the SVG, and then you can size it with CSS?
A macro that covers... Yeah, so the problem is that as soon as you want to create CSS, that means going off and creating another tiddler tag.
Yeah, then you can no. You can use inline styling. So if you really need to.
No, but you can't. How would you do it?
Because
don't forget that here's the simple example. So we're transcluding that tiddler. In order to change the size, we would need to reach into the tiddler itself, because it's the contents of the close button tiddler here that determines its size. So what we really want is for the transclusion to be able to set a property, for want of a better word, that is then picked up by the tiddler itself. And
I think it's just now you just need to cover the SVG the SVG elements in a proper image tag with the macro.
But if we wrap the SVG, we can't. Sorry, Nick, are you trying to say something as well? Let me just mute Nick.
I think I will make some experiments.
Sorry, you was Mary. I didn't quite catch what you were suggesting. You're saying
a standard SVG image has some more metadata. That there is a wrap around this SVG tag, and I think with the macro you can adjust it. But you don't have the wiki text.
I don't quite understand. I mean, so if we look at a full SVG like this, then you get the XML declaration and the doc type before you get the SVG element.
Yeah.
But that's not the problem here. The problem here is that we want to transclude something and change it at the same time as transcluding it, because we want to change this size.
Yeah, but if you cover the stuff in a macro, I think it's doable. The problem is that you don't have any text image anymore.
So perhaps this is what you mean. So we could. You mean this? So what I've done now is made so I think this is what you just were suggesting, Mario, but I'm not sure if I've understood.
Something similar like this, yeah.
Yeah. So I've turned the image into a macro, and the motivation of doing that is that then at the time that I invoke it, I'm able to specify a width and height. So I put the preview on. You can see that is happening, and if I change that to 144, I get an even bigger one. So yes, that is an approach that could be made to work. My down on it is backwards compatibility, obviously, that it would change change all the existing images. You could imagine that the existing images would become an invocation of the macro, and then we'd have a whole another set of tiddlers that contained the actual definitions themselves. So yeah, it's you're on the right lines, I think. But look, the other approach I was thinking about was picking up a problem an issue that we've had in the groups, is that people find these two different types of SVG images incredibly confusing. Really, let me just go back to the original version of this. yes, people find it confusing that this is an image, and yet its content type is blank, which means that it's defaulting to the TiddlyWiki 5 content type. And because that means that we can't distinguish these images by their type, so one of the things the core does is introduce this tag, the image tag, so that we can find all of the images that we should offer the user in the tag chooser. So you may have seen that in the tag chooser, when I choose an icon, it gives me a complete list of all of the available icons. And now those things, those are wiki text tiddlers that are being transcluded here. So we can't select them by type, and instead we select them via that tag. Now, one other possibility is to do this. So there's a couple of things going on here. We've invented a new MIME type for wiki text images. So syntactically, a wiki text image would actually be the same type as a wiki text tiddler, but by giving them a separate type, that allows us to do some processing differently. And in particular, when we come to transclude one of these tiddlers, we can create the SVG element that wraps this content. In order to do that, we need the view box, so that's why I've moved that into a field. So it's a field accompanying the main body of the image. And obviously the other thing that goes onto the SVG element is the width and height that the user desires. So this approach, it's kind of, pros and cons. It's a bit, to me, it's less clunky than the macro thing. The macro thing means that every image now needs to exist as a global macro, and that's quite bad. Global, we're not supposed to. We don't want hundreds and hundreds of global macros accumulating. The downside of this approach is that it breaks SVG. That as a as a newcomer, if I just look at this, there's no obvious way for me to tell that it's an SVG image, and whereas at least previously, by having
and you also lose all the SVG metadata. So if there is RFD tags or something like this, then it's also lost. Well, probably, and copy pasting it from an editor will be quite hard.
But we've already got that problem, of course, because there's our images undergo a good bit of processing to remove explicit colors and so on, so that they work properly in TiddlyWiki. So it's, I take your point. I absolutely agree that one of the, it's terribly dark in here. That one of the disadvantages of that approach is it makes for non-standard SVG images, but we already have non-standard SVG images.
Yeah. This is a minor bug. If you were to go back to that screen, I can show you, in edit mode. I was misled by, just any arbitrary thing. Down at the bottom it says add a new field and then add. Well, I thought, you had to press add in order to add a field, whereas this add, the button actually should be update. Accept.
I would absolutely agree that the current text is confusing, but I'm not so certain what the best answer is.
Accept, perhaps.
Well,
and then automatically.
The disadvantage with accept is that I don't know of other places where it's used in a similar way. So the reason why this is like this is that the trope of a text box and then an add button is a common thing.
But it looks the way it's shaded that it can't be filled in until you press the add button.
And I think you shouldn't be able to press the add button until you filled anything in. So the add, I mean, I think there's a couple of issues that the add button should be disabled until the name has been specified.
That's one possibility. Or if you're going to do it the way it is now, to say update or accept.
Well, I think the trouble I have with update is that if I've already got a field, then I update it by editing it directly, not by clicking the update button. So the
heading return, you mean?
Yeah. So no, if I've got
add something there.
I've got those fields. If I want to change the value of that field, I just go here.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's no problem.
Yeah, but what it means is that the update button being there, this being labeled update, doesn't feel quite clear, because an update to me would be modifying, a value that I've already assigned.
So let's say accept as opposed to update.
What I've learned with this UI stuff is that what's actually hard is pointing out the problems that need to be fixed. So I think that
I was messed up in my editing because of this problem.
Yes, I know, but what I'm getting at is that I think the solutions that you're suggesting aren't necessarily any better than the solution that we've got at the moment. So that's the concern, because
I submit to your judgment because you're the project leader, of course.
Well, look, the issue is that there's ambiguity in what add means, and that making doing accept. So look, again, I think what I'm trying to say is talking about ways of dealing with open source projects. That the I think what you did there was point out a problem and then immediately point out a solution, and so therefore the discussion became about whether your solution was a good one. And I can see some ambiguities in the solutions that you came up with, but I think the solutions that you proposed were part of a conversation about the problem. Now, and they illustrate what the problem is very nicely. So what I think makes is useful is to try and separate these two things. So pointing out that this is something that needs fixing is useful, because that's sort of, I've said before, a big part of my job is figuring out which of the thousands upon thousands of things could be fixed or improved about TiddlyWiki, to try and figure out which of those are important. So in order to do that, not just for myself, I need feedback like that, and it's very easy for me to lose track of how confusing the add button is. But what worries me is if that message gets transformed instantly into a proposed solution, then the trouble with the proposed solution discussion is that one can knock on the head. One may be able to rule out a solution, and so if what's been offered onto the agenda is a solution, and you rule out that solution, then there's no mechanism for going back and dealing with the underlying problem. So I think in a situation like this, the perfect thing to do is to make a ticket, and you make the ticket to point out what the problem is. So the name of the ticket isn't the solution, it's the problem that you're pointing to, with a proposed solution in that. Then I think that's useful.
It suggests that there needs to be a book written for people like me, how to participate effectively and efficiently with an open source project.
In that regard, we're cutting new ground. So something that I've discussed before here is that the vast majority of open source projects, the people who make the code and the people who consume the code, are basically the same audience, the same group, whereas TiddlyWiki has quite distinct users and contributors, and that's difficult. And the open source model, I think we do pretty well, because there's a relatively small number of projects I think that are like this. Most of them that are like this are things like Firefox. And Firefox is made by an organization, that's a fake Microsoft. It's a deliberate attempt to create an organization that can out Microsoft. So it's not surprising that they can do quite well what Microsoft does, i.e. deliver software to end users. But in open source, it's relatively rare. There's a few things like GIMP, for instance, is an application that image editing application that has users that are distinct from their developers. So we've touched on this a few times, but the main issue or main useful thing to remember is, well, not a useful thing to remember, is a point I made before, really, that the changing the core is hard. The core has its own agenda. The way to experiment with new stuff is in plugins. And so then your challenge is that you're not necessarily got the technical skills to put together a plugin and so on, but that's where I think one of the areas where this community does work brilliantly well is that you've got people like Jed, Nathan, who absolutely are developers from a developer background, and they're plugged right into a community, the community of people who are using it. Or Felix, another great example with TiddlyMap. Felix, I think, he did an amazing bit of work early on in order to satisfy his own needs, and then he did a whole load more work to polish it into shape for other people. And I think, I'm guessing that it was partly the very positive reaction he had to the first bit of work that kind of gave him the energy to undertake the second bit of work. So we need more Felixes and Jeds in the group, because we've got a lot of Nicks and Eds and, I don't know, people who are generating all these fabulous ideas for the things that we could do. And we need to do our best.
But we need a reality check, which you just have given us.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it sounds discouraging, but it's the bit I'm being discouraging about is is that actually I think things are better than they seem, because what I'm basically been pointing out is that the core, it's very hard for the core to meet all of your needs, and it's very hard for the core to be the forum for experimentation to meet your needs. But if the core was the only route to meet your needs, then it would mean that the only person who could meet your needs was me, probably. Whereas at least by shifting things into plugins, then it becomes possible for other people to do them, so you lose a little bit of the serializing everything through the single copy of Jeremy that we have at the moment.
Jeremy, for exactly this, I share for exactly this problem that Nick introduced, showed you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So there is the input field, and in normal cases, this input field. So if I do a reload, I just did some tests. Reloading it. Oops.
Want to save it? Or
no, it won't reload. Why? Okay. So here, this input field. If I have a look at the CSS, it is gray. Yeah, and in normal cases, if an input box is grayed out, it means you can't access it. Right?
Oh yeah. No, Nick said that as well. I agree.
It would be to make it white again, so it's a little bit lighter now. Yeah? Or maybe you have a different light.
No, I agree.
So, and this could be fixed relatively easy because if you have a user style sheet. So it now changes this input boxes too. So there would need to be some adjustments. But I think exactly this problem could be solved easily. And if you post an issue, then probably someone will come up with a solution like this. So if you feel better if it's yellow or light green or something like this, or even white, then just create the style sheet and then I think it's fixed.
Yeah, I can see how you're manipulating it with the debugger, which I have myself. So
yeah, but this is just for demonstrating it so that we can see the difference. Yeah, and And in normal cases, it is gray, and grayed out input box means don't touch it, or you can't touch it. So this may be a little bit misleading. Because there is so also Firefox introduced this shadow, which I don't like very much. But okay, they introduced it, and now it seems as if this is grayed out, which in case it isn't.
Precisely. Yeah. My point.
Yeah. There's I must say there's a couple of tickets that you might have seen proposing significant overhauls of the edit template, and it's something that we've not touched. So there's been, I think it's one of these areas where the problems are, quite severe. So there's problems of visual hierarchy, clarity, behavior, all kinds of things. It's in making proposals to try and fix those problems, I think we often tend to propose things that are quite elaborate, that then there's an obstacle to implementing them. But I do think it's something I'd really like to sort out, and I do have a look in GitHub, because there's some mock-ups that you might find interesting. They're really quite nice, thoughtful pieces of work. Right, I must draw to a close, but as I said at the beginning, this week we're going to have a second hangout on Saturday at midday UK time for, well, initially I booked it for 3 hours, but we'll see how it goes. Terrific if any of you can make it, and of course also hoping that there might be some fresh faces there as well. And then there won't be a hangout next Tuesday, a week today, and they'll resume on the normal days in 2 weeks' time, when we'll see obviously how Saturdays goes as to whether we have any more of them on a Saturday. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we close?
Yeah. There is a new user, it's Alex, and he stayed there for some minutes already. So maybe you can activate him when you switch off the live stream, so he can talk then.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's, before I close then, it's for me to say thank you very much to everybody for attending. Much appreciate your time and attention. And as I always say, it's an incredibly useful session for me. It gives me much food for thought, and I really appreciate you giving up your time like this. I'm sorry that we can't cover everything in these sessions, and as usual, very conscious that there's lots of interesting discussions I've missed in the chat window scrolling past. But for the moment, guys, thank you very much, and we'll wave goodbye, and I'll stop the broadcast.
Bye.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.